Well, hope you had a good day today in Sunday school. I think a lot of us experienced an impactful day and good number of people showing up for Easter, so we appreciate all that. Next week's lesson is back in Mark chapter 10, so we'll be returning to our normal cycle of events, but I just thought to get the discussion going, you could probably ask the question and maybe get some noted feedback on have you ever been in a position where people push to be in power and don't care who they hurt in the process? I imagine most of us that have lived our lives, that's even happened in the family, where I get pushed around by people who are trying to climb the ladder of success.
Your sister?
My sister.
Yeah.
All you gotta watch those women.
Well, this is the familiar story in Mark 10 about James and John. What do we know them by? What is when we say James and John?
Sons of Thunder.
They are known as the sons of Zebedee.
So Zebedee was known as Thunder?
Apparently.
Yeah. Oh, that was his nickname.
Yeah. You could always ask in your Sunday school class, as I do regularly, and get a blank look, is who was the father of the sons of Zebedee? Zebedee. They just look at you like, what? Okay, so the sons of Thunder. And anyway, you'll remember that James and John are part of that inner triad with Peter that frequently are asked to do come with Jesus and get special things to watch and observe, including most recently our lesson from a couple weeks ago on where we talked about them being on the Sermon Mount Transfiguration in chapter 9. Okay, so today this is the familiar story, but I hope we can look at it with some fresh eyes, where James and John come to Jesus with a question. Okay, now keep in mind this is the last trip that they are making to Jerusalem. Jesus has announced just prior to our text, once again, that he's going to go to Jerusalem. He is going to be arrested. He is going to be crucified. He's going to rise from the dead. And it was like, once again, it just went right past them. But in that discussion of his willingness to be the ultimate servant, even to the point of death, they come to Jesus with a question. And so we're going to look at the request, and then the reaction, and then the ransom, which I got pretty excited about just studying.
And it alliterates for my opinion.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I'm glad you approved, Brother Dan. It's so infrequent. But James and John came to Jesus, and they asked, Lord, will you give us whatever we ask for? Which I do make the point that at least they had the confidence that they could come to Jesus, and they knew if he was willing, he could answer this request. And so Jesus doesn't just say, okay, what's your request? I mean, he probes a little bit because he's trying to get to the motive. You know, what are you really asking? Okay? That's all there in the text. Well, I went ahead and pointed out that the brothers wanted to get the desires of their heart. And what was it that they asked Jesus?
Sitting right in the
Position.
Yes.
Yeah.
Lord, this is what we want. When you come into your kingdom, when you become the king, we want to sit at your right hand and your left hand. And now, what's different in Matthew's account of this particular story that's not told in Mark?
Mom.
Yes, good, Tim.
Mama.
Yeah, Mama Zebedee gets involved. And it's... But what I want you to see clearly is Mark just goes right to the heart of the matter. He skips the part about Mom being involved. But it's clear in both accounts, because even in the Matthew account, when their mother asks the question, Jesus immediately turns to James and John with the follow-up stuff. He knows exactly who's behind putting her up to asking the question. It's just a little bit more of a, hopefully, an opportunity for a coercion in Jesus' heart to answer her request, right? In any event, Mark just goes right to the heart of the matter and says, Jesus says, do you know what you're asking? Right? And so, first of all, the question is, can we be seated at your right hand, at your left hand? And it was a bold maneuver. They were trying to obviously take a little bit of initiative here and let the Lord know what they really would prefer when this all came down. Okay. What was the question Jesus asked them? And I just say, have them paraphrase it in their own words. But what was it that Jesus asked them in return? They said, you know,
Are you going to be able to suffer or drink the cup that I'm
yes.
going to drink of?
In fact, it says specifically, are you able to drink the cup and be baptized with the baptism that's required? And they rather unthinkingly just say, we can. Yeah. And then Jesus says, you will. But you don't know what you're getting into here, okay? So that's point number 2, the reaction in verse 39, the latter part there, they say, we can. And Jesus proceeds to let them know that yes, indeed, you will experience this cup and this baptism. I did not make, as some do, any real correlation between the cup and baptism. You know, with some talk about the Lord's Supper and baptism being the ordinances of the church. Clearly, in the context of this, Jesus is talking about suffering. You know, these are the words he used in the garden, right? Lord, if it be your will, let this cup pass from me, right? But Jesus says to them, after their rather immediate and unthinking response, yes, we can. We can take the cup. We can suffer, or we can take whatever is dished out. Jesus proceeds to say, you really will. Now you will have to one day face suffering and testings, and you will indeed drink the cup and will be baptized. And I did include that the early Christians, and I've mentioned this before, but the early Christians talked about this attitude and desire or willingness to suffer for Jesus, baptism by blood. And Jesus really is responding to them saying, yes, you will be able to, you will have to take this in the future. All right. In that context of the reaction, of course, we're also going to see the result of the other disciples. And in Mark's typical understated way of saying it, he said about the other disciples, the other 10, they began to be much displeased with James and John. You think? I mean, this turns into a fight. Now, why do you think the other 10 responded so negatively towards James and John at the time of their question?
They wanted to be.
Yes, they just got scooped.
Yeah.
We didn't take the initiative.
We didn't think of it first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Or we weren't bold enough
Yes.
to do it first. And so I like this quote someone's rightly said, indignation is perception of unfair treatment. Those guys perceived that they were being unfairly treated because James and John had the inner track. And so that's why they were mad. Well, Jesus immediately turns the whole moment, as he always does, into a teachable moment. And he begins to deal with all of them on the issue of their pride. Really, when you get to it, James and John, there's some pride there that initiates their initial question. They really wanted to be in the places of honor. And Jesus, of course, did say, it's not mine to give. It's the Father, right? Yeah,
It
Mike.
reminds me of the parable that they missed the message of first shall be last and the
Yes.
last shall be first.
You know, how many times has Jesus taught that, right? And this is another time. All right. verses 42 to 45, he talks about the ransom. And really it's in 45, but it's just a powerful statement. Because Jesus he shares with them, listen, this is how the Gentiles, this is how the pagan people deal with leadership. They overlord it. They push other people aside. They climb to the top. And it's he makes the point that this is not the way that we do it. And so he uses two words in there that I emphasize, and it's the word diakonos, which we understand that's the Greek word diakonos, and it's translated what?
Deacons.
That's where we get the word deacon from. The word is in the text servant. And that's exactly what deacon means, right? Servant. In Acts 6, they're selecting these servants that can wait on tables, and that's the term Jesus uses here. He also uses another term, which is actually, minister is the diakonos interpretation. The term translated servant is actually the Greek word doulos. And what's doulos in the Greek? Some of you that have had background in Greek.
Servant.
Yeah, it really has to do with a slave. Literally, you'll see the way I defined it. It meant someone totally owned by a master with no rights except what the owner permitted. Well, we kind of soften that term in our culture because we don't use the term slave very often. But in that day, doulos meant slave. And the early Christians who followed Jesus considered a great honor to be worthy to be called a slave of Jesus, a bond servant of Jesus Christ. All right. And then verse 45, Jesus gives the whole punchline to this when he says, he himself had humbled himself. The creator God of the universe had taken on the form of a man and submitted himself to be a servant. Right? And Jesus is the perfect example of servant leadership. And he goes on to say to them, I did not come to be ministered unto, but to minister, and to give my life a ransom for many. And the clear teaching of that is the whole idea of ransom. That, of course, has to do with purchasing, buying back, redeeming someone out of the marketplace of sin. And that's exactly what Jesus is stressing here. He came for the sole purpose of redeeming, ransoming those who were in bondage. And so that's really the emphasis here. Jesus explains how he was going to provide that redemption and purchase out of the marketplace of sin with his own precious blood, right? And when it says that he gave his life a ransom for many, the phrase implicitly means in the place of many, on behalf of many, Jesus was going to ransom anybody that would accept the gift of his purchase. All right? So Jesus demonstrated humble service by paying the ransom for our sin. That's the big idea of this lesson. It's just illustrated by James and John initiating this desire to have preeminence. And Jesus said, hey, the first shall be last. Right? Okay, I think you have a good time. Yes, Jim?
When they said, when James and John come up with that question, were they thinking in Jerusalem or a heavenly kingdom?
No, they were clearly thinking of an earthly kingdom.
Okay.
They still believed this was going to turn out to be Jesus as the
They wanted to be a big shot in Jerusalem.